I'm Dr. Angie Stoehr, and this is Feminine Curiosities. I had a patient today that was asking about menopause. She wanted to know if she was in menopause and what labs might be available to test for that. So let's talk about the definition of menopause and whether or not labs may be helpful and how to do those. I'm going to leave stuff like the treatment of menopause and abnormal timing for menopause in detail to another video. Lots of information there. So the definition of menopause is 1 year with no periods. That gets a little complicated. I can think that you might be able to imagine some situations in which that shouldn't work. For instance, 1 year without periods in a 25-year-old. Not normal. Normal age range is from 40 to 65. So somewhere in there with 1 year without periods would be considered probable menopause. But also consider situations where someone, say, has had a hysterectomy. Without the uterus and cervix, you can't have a period anymore, but your ovaries may still be functioning just fine. In those particular situations, it's a completely different set of things that we do to try and get an idea for menopause. Now, the reason I say that is it's actually really difficult to diagnose menopause in somebody who's had a hysterectomy. And the reason for that is there's not an exact cutoff for the lab value we use to say definitively we're menopausal. Now, there's definitely levels at which we would say probably in menopause, but there's a lot of other levels that you would think may be considered abnormal, like 40 or 60, that really kind of just give us a gestalt, a guess. Maybe, probably getting there, may not necessarily be fully in menopause. So what lab am I talking about here? This lab is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. That hormone is made by the brain to tell the ovaries to stimulate a follicle. It makes a follicle grow from the ovaries. So the ovaries see the FSH, they know, hey, probably time to ovulate sometime soon. Maybe we should go ahead and make a follicle for that. When you're in a normal, under 40, having regular periods, FSH tells the ovaries to make a follicle. The ovaries make the follicle, secrete some hormones back, and it tells the brain, hey, we're good to go. Now, when the ovaries have stopped functioning completely, they start not listening anymore. Meh. It's kind of like my kids when I tell them to pick up their socks. Meh. And you know, my natural reaction to my kids not picking up my socks is to say it louder. Just like the brain does, it says with FSH, hey, I said you need to make a follicle. And the ovaries are still going, meh. How this works is the FSH gets higher and higher, trying to stimulate the ovaries that are just not responding. So the lab value we look at is FSH, and an elevated FSH is where we start guessing whether or not we're in menopause. And the reason it's not super easy is because of how the FSH changes throughout the normal cycle, and also when we do the lab. So let me show you how this works. This is what I show my patients in the office. When you are younger, this is how your hormone level FSH goes. This is the normal values. You get a nice little rise and fall based on the ovary responding and the brain secreting the hormone. Now, when you are less young, this is still the normal range here, but instead of having a nice little ebb and flow, your hormones are wackadoodle. They are going all over the place. We would only know that the FSH was elevated, like I said, which indicates or gives us a gestalt about menopause, if we happen to catch you on these, say, 5 days of the cycle. So the other, 23 days of a 28-day cycle, you would still fall within the normal range or just below normal, in which case most of the time we don't take that much into stock. So while you're around the time of menopause but haven't gone a complete year without a period, you're going to fall into this range. Now, this time period where your hormones get funky like this can last for a long time, 5 to 8 years. So this swinging of the hormones is what causes the symptoms of perimenopause, stuff like hot flashes, mood swings, irritability. These big swings start happening and causing those symptoms to arise when you're down here on the estrogen, really low on the estrogen. So that's actually when the FSH is really high here. So when the FSH is high, your estrogen is low. And when the FSH is low, the estrogen's high. Confusing, right? So FSH being elevated makes the estrogen low, which is should be a completely different graph. It's kind of confusing. Low estrogen is what creates the symptoms. So hot flashes, mood swings, irritability, anxiety, all the not fun stuff that you get around menopause. But actually getting a lab value in this range when you're not fully menopausal, a little hard. Now, once you fully go into menopause and the ovaries completely don't respond anymore, you're always going to land up here, and usually fairly high up here, enough so that we would say, oh yeah, an FSH of 85, probably menopausal. So when you don't have a uterus and you don't have a cervix, FSH is just a guess for quite some time. Now, if you get a really high elevated FSH, yes, possible. We could say with a little bit more certainty that you're probably menopausal. Now, the truth is, whether or not you're in menopause doesn't really matter unless you have postmenopausal bleeding. It does change the way we do some medication doses, and it changes some of the insurance viability for things. You know, they're not going to cover certain medications pre versus post-menopause. But whether or not you're menopausal really is only important as far as whether or not you have bleeding post-menopause. So if you're in that time period of 40 to 65 and you stop having a period for a full year and then you have bleeding afterwards, you need to let us know. But the truth is, if you're having symptoms, we just treat them. If you're in the age prior to when most people go into menopause, and most women go into menopause in the US somewhere between like 51 and 53, that's kind of like the narrow range. Again, normal, much greater range than that, but the narrow range of 51 to 53. We'll treat symptoms. Under the 51 range or so, we treat them typically with birth control if you qualify for that. And I'm going to leave that up to your gynecologist to tell you whether or not you qualify for birth control. And after the age of 53 or so, we often do hormone replacement therapy. That 51 to 53 year range, depending on where you're at and whether or not you've been on something before, is really kind of up to your desire and your discussion with your gynecologist. So if you're having symptoms, whether or not you're technically in menopause doesn't really matter. We treat the symptoms and we go from there. Again, treatment for symptoms of menopause, completely different video, way too much information for one at a time. If you guys have any questions, shoot me messages below. Please subscribe down here, give me likes, that I know we're going along the right track.